The Armstrong Ranch covers 50,000 acres of South Texas brush country, and on the evening of the 11th of February, 2006, Richard Bruce Cheney, Vice President of the United States, raised a shotgun on that ground and fired more than 200 pellets into the face and neck of a 78-year-old attorney. Its southern fence is the King Ranch, 825,000 acres, and the county around it holds 350 people. But the shooting is the only part of this ranch's history most Americans know, and it is the least of it. The land reached the family through a state senator dead in 1858, and a widow left with nothing while 2 lawyers held every acre he had bought. It was taken up by a Texas ranger who had crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico with no orders and no authority to be there. It was carried into Washington by a rancher's wife who sat on the board of the company that would hire the man with the shotgun. And that night, a sheriff's deputy was turned away at the ranch gate. The story begins on ground Spain had already given away. Chapter 1. The ground no one could hold. The country the Armstrong Ranch sits on does not look like a prize. It is flat coastal plain running east toward the Gulf, scrubbed over with mesquite and prickly pear and huisac, cut by sand ridges, and in a dry season it will kill cattle in a matter of weeks. There is no river through it. There is no timber on it. For most of the 19th century there was almost no one on it either, and the men who first rode across it named it for the only animals that seemed to thrive there. They called it the Wild Horse Desert. The government in Austin, when it referred to the region at all, called it the Nueces Strip. The county that now administers the Armstrong pastures is Kennedy County, spelled with a single letter N. It has nothing whatever to do with the presidential family of Massachusetts. It carries the name of a South Texas cattle dynasty that still holds land inside its own boundaries, and the confusion of the 2 names is one reason almost nothing that happened here has ever reached a national audience. The emptiness was deceptive. This ground was not unclaimed, and it was not unowned. Long before any Anglo rider crossed it, the Spanish crown had carved the whole of the coastal plain into grants of a size that would be unimaginable to a European farmer, measured not in acres, but in leagues, and handed them to the families who would run cattle and horses on them. One of those grants was called La Barreta. It lay in what is now Kennedy County, and it was held by the family of Jose Francisco Bali. That is the fact the founding stories of South Texas are built to leave out. The land had been surveyed, granted, and inherited long before any American rode across it. Every acre of it already had a name attached, a survey behind it, and heirs waiting on it. What changed in the middle of the 19th century was not who lived on the ground, it was who held the paper. The pattern that follows in this film is set here, and it never varies afterward. In the Nueces Strip, the great transfers of land almost never happened at gunpoint. They happened by deed, by probate, by lawsuit, and by the quiet arithmetic of a family that could afford a lawyer meeting a family that could not. Consider how late the state itself arrived. Kennedy County was not organized until 1921, which makes it one of the last counties formed in Texas. By that year, the Armstrong Ranch had already existed for 2 generations. The King Ranch on its southern fence was older still. The ranches on this plain were not built inside a county. The county was built decades afterward around ranches that were already there, and it was assembled out of the land those families had not needed to give up. That is what it means to say a private holding predates the government that regulates it. There was no courthouse to appeal to when the land changed hands, because there was no county. There was no sheriff of one's own to call, because the nearest one was a day away over sand. When something went wrong out here, it was settled among the families who owned the country, on their own ground on their own schedule. 150 years later, on a February evening, it would be settled exactly the same way. I want to hear from the people whose families actually worked this country, because the record is thin and the memory is not. If your people ran cattle in the brush between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, or if your family name sits on one of the old Spanish grant papers, what were you told about how the Armstrongs came by that land? Put it in the comments. The version that got written down is not always the version that got passed down. Because the Armstrongs were not the first family on this ground, and they were not even the first family to buy a piece of it at scale. That distinction belongs to a merchant from East Texas who rode into the Wild Horse Desert in the spring of 1852, looked at a stretch of brush that could not support a town, and decided to buy 14 leagues of it. He would be dead inside 6 years, and everything he bought would be gone. Chapter 2. The Senator Who Bought Too Much Land. The man who assembled the Armstrong Ranch never carried the name Armstrong, and he did not live long enough to see a single fence go up on it. James H. Durst was born about 1819 in Nacogdoches, in the deep pine country of East Texas, as far from the coastal brush as a Texan could be born and still be a Texan. He came of age in a republic that was still deciding by force who would be permitted to stay inside it. In 1838 and 1839, he served as captain of a Texas Ranger company engaged in actions against the Cherokees, which is the polite phrase the record uses for the campaign that emptied East Texas of the people who had been farming it. The following year, in 1840, the state put him to a different kind of work. James Durst was made a commissioner charged with investigating fraudulent land claims in Nacogdoches County. He spent that year going through other men's paper, looking for the seams where a title had been forged, backdated, or quietly transferred out from under someone who could not read it. He was, by profession, a man who knew exactly how land was stolen in Texas. That detail is worth holding on to. By the early 1850s, Durst had moved south. His first wife, Elizabeth Culp, whom he had married in 1843, was dead, and he had relocated to Rio Grande City in Starr County, on the river, where he ran a large general merchandise store. A store on that stretch of the Rio Grande in that decade was not a shop. It was a clearinghouse. Goods, credit, information, and rumor moved through it, and the man behind the counter learned before anyone else which families were solvent and which families were not. In the spring of 1852, he rode north and east into the Wild Horse Desert, and in the last months of that year he bought 14 leagues of the La Barreta grant from the descendants of José Francisco Bali. A league is a Spanish measure, and the purchase was reckoned in leagues because the country was too large to be usefully described in acres. 14 of them, bought in a single transaction, in a region where almost no Anglo had yet acquired anything at that scale. The Handbook of Texas records it plainly as one of the earliest large land purchases in the Nueces Strip. Durst had done what the men who came after him would spend 50 years trying to do, and he had done it first, and he had done it by contract rather than by conquest. The purchase changed what he was. In 1853, the voters sent him to Austin. James Durst took his seat in the Senate of the 5th Texas Legislature on the 8th of November, 1853, and held it until the 5th of November, 1855, representing a district of 6 counties: Nueces, San Patricio, Starr, Webb, Refugio, and Kinney. It was a jurisdiction larger than several eastern states, and it contained almost no voters, which is precisely why a man who owned 14 leagues of it could hold it. He was a ranger captain, a fraud commissioner, a merchant on the Rio Grande, a state senator, and later the deputy collector of customs for the Brazos-Santiago district at Port Isabel. In 1854, he married again to Mary Josephine Atwood on the 11th of January. They had 2 children who lived, a son, James William, and a daughter, Mary Helena, whom the family called Molly. Everything that follows in this story runs through that daughter, because for all the offices and all the leagues, what James Durst had actually built was a paper estate in a country with no courthouse. His title rested on a Spanish grant, translated through a republic, then a state, then a war, and finally through a set of American land laws written by men who had every incentive to find the old grants defective. He knew better than almost anyone alive how vulnerable that made him, because he had been paid by the state to find exactly that kind of weakness in other men's deeds. He had bought more land than a man in his position could safely hold, in a place where the nearest court was days away, and he had done it in a decade when the machinery for taking such land was being assembled all around him. He had 6 years left. Chapter 3. The Widow and the 2 Lawyers. He died on the 24th of April, 1858, at his ranch in the brush, of what the record calls an enlargement of the heart. James Durst was somewhere near 39 years old. There was no hospital within reach of that ranch house. There was no county, no courthouse, no probate judge sitting anywhere nearby, and no telegraph line running out to the coastal plain to carry the news. A man died on his own ground out there, and the ground stayed exactly as it was, and everything that determined what happened next was written on paper held somewhere else, by somebody else. What he left behind was a widow of about 4 years' standing, Mary Josephine Atwood Durst, 2 small children, and 14 leagues of the La Barreta grant. She never saw a dollar of it. The state's own historical record does not soften the account. After Durst's death, in its words, allegations of illegal land sales and attorney malpractice surfaced. His widow received no money, and 2 lawyers held all the land. Read that sequence slowly because it is the entire mechanism of this film compressed into one line. The estate did not fail. It did not get sold off in pieces to pay debts, and it was not lost in a bad season or a market collapse. It was administered. Somewhere between the death of a state senator in a brush country ranch house and the settlement of his affairs, the legal work that was supposed to protect a widow and 2 children instead transferred 14 leagues of South Texas into the hands of the men doing the work. Nobody rode up to that house with a gun. Nobody had to. And the cruelty in it, the part that would be unbelievable in fiction, is what James Durst had done for a living 18 years earlier. In 1840, the state of Texas had commissioned him to investigate fraudulent land claims in Nacogdoches County. He had spent a year reading other men's deeds for exactly this. He had known, better than almost anyone in Texas, how a title could be moved without its owner's consent, and he had built his family's entire future on a stack of Spanish grant paper anyway, because in that country there was nothing else to build on. The man who investigated land fraud for the state died and became a case of it. Consider what that meant for the woman left behind. She had no cash because the land had absorbed it. She had no income because the ranch was brush and the store was on the river a hard journey away. She could not sell what she did not hold title to, and she could not fight for the title without lawyers, and the lawyers were the other side. The nearest seat of American law was days off across sand and mesquite, and the men in possession were not fugitives hiding from the courts. They were officers of them. This is what the phrase dark power means when it is stripped of drama. What it describes is an asymmetry. One party understands the instrument, and the other party only owns the thing the instrument describes. The Durst family did not recover the land in that generation, They did not recover it in the next 10 years or the next 15. The fight to prove what had been done ran on, unfinished, while the children grew up in a country that was still not a county, and while the ranch they were supposed to have inherited sat out there under other men's names, running nothing, fenced by nobody, waiting. It would take until the 1880s. It would take a lawsuit that finally proved the fraud. And it would take a partner the family did not yet have, because the Dursts by themselves did not have the money, the standing, or the appetite for a fight of that length against members of the Texas bar. They would need a man who was comfortable with a long pursuit, somebody who did not stop when the trail crossed a state line or a national one, somebody who understood that the law, out here, was less a set of rules than a weapon that belonged to whoever picked it up first. In the spring of 1858, when James Durst died and his widow was left with nothing, that man was 8 years old, and he was living in Tennessee. Chapter 4. They Crossed the River Without Orders. John Barclay Armstrong was born on the first day of January, 1850, in McMinnville, Tennessee, 400 miles of hard country away from any land his family would ever own. He came to Texas in 1872, 22 years old, with no ranch, no capital, and no name that meant anything on the Rio Grande. 3 years later, he took the job that made him. On the 20th of May, 1875, Armstrong enlisted in the Special Force commanded by Captain Leander H. McNelly. The Special Force was not an ordinary company of Rangers. It was a state instrument, raised and pointed at the Nueces Strip, at a moment when Austin had concluded that the cattle moving south across the river were leaving faster than any sheriff on that plain could stop. What the state wanted was not policing. What the state wanted was a result, and it selected a commander who would not ask permission before producing one. Armstrong made sergeant inside the year. Somewhere in that first season of fighting on the brush flats, he acquired the name the other Rangers used for him afterward, and it was not affectionate so much as descriptive. They called him McNelly's Bulldog. A bulldog is not admired for judgment. It is admired for not letting go. What that meant in practice can be measured on a single night in November. On the 20th of November, 1875, McNelly took his special force to the bank of the Rio Grande, opposite the Las Cuevas Ranch in Tamaulipas, and crossed. Sergeant John Barclay Armstrong went over with them, in a rowboat, a few men at a time, in the dark, onto the sovereign territory of the Republic of Mexico, with no authorization from the United States government to be there and no legal standing of any kind once they arrived. They moved on foot through brush and scrub oak toward an outpost called the Rincon de Cucharas and walked into an estimated 400 men under General Juan Flores Salinas. What happened next was not a Ranger legend. It was an international incident with witnesses in uniform. On the Texas side of the river, drawn up along the bank, stood elements of the United States Army, the 24th Infantry, and the 8th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel James F. Randlett. They had explicit orders from Fort Brown not to support the operation. They supported it anyway. American regular soldiers opened up across the Rio Grande with a Gatling gun in defense of the state policemen who had invaded another country on their own initiative. More than 400 head of cattle came back across the water, and when the order finally reached McNelly to withdraw, he sent his reply back up the chain to the Secretary of War of the United States, in words the Rangers repeated for the next 50 years. "Give my compliments to the Secretary of War, and tell him and his United States soldiers to go to hell." That is the sentence to keep in mind for the rest of this story, because the men who came out of that force did not understand themselves as servants of a legal order. They understood the legal order as something that arrived after them, ratified what they had already done, and stayed out of the way. They had crossed a national border without orders, been covered by an army that had been told not to cover them, and been rewarded for it. The lesson was not that the law could stop them. The lesson was that the law would eventually be brought around. That was the education John Barclay Armstrong received in his 20s in the exact country where the Durst family had lost everything on paper 20 years earlier, and it is impossible to separate it from what he became afterward. Within a decade, he would be sitting on 50,000 acres of that same brush. Within a decade and a half, his family would be prosecuting a fraud suit against members of the Texas bar and winning it. The state had trained him to pursue and to keep pursuing after every reasonable person had stopped. Nobody in Texas would understand what that meant until the summer of 1877, when the most wanted man in the state left for Alabama under another name, and the bulldog followed him out of Texas, out of the South, and onto a railway platform on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Chapter 5. The Bounty That Bought a Ranch. On the 26th of January, 1877, John Barclay Armstrong was made second lieutenant of the Special Force. He was 27 years old, and he had 18 months in front of him that would put his name in every newspaper in Texas. In April, he helped take John King Fisher, one of the most feared men on the border. In December, he killed John Mayfield in Wilson County. In July of the following year, he rode in the pursuit that ended with Sam Bass shot down in the street at Round Rock. Any one of those would have made a career on the frontier. He did all three inside a year and a half, and none of them is what he is remembered for. The state of Texas had posted $4,000 for the capture of John Wesley Hardin. $4,000 in the 1870s was not a bounty. It was a fortune with a man's name attached. It was more money than a ranger lieutenant would see in a decade of service, and it was offered because the state had concluded that ordinary law enforcement was never going to produce Hardin, who had left Texas entirely and was living under another name in the Gulf South. Every peace officer in the region understood what $4,000 meant. Only one of them followed the trail out of the state and kept going. Armstrong pursued Hardin into Alabama and then into Florida. Consider what that required of a Texas state officer in 1877. He had no jurisdiction east of the Sabine. He had no federal warrant power of his own. He was operating 1,000 miles from anyone who could confirm who he was, in states that had their own courts, their own sheriffs, and their own reasons to resent a Texan arriving with a pistol and an opinion about who ought to be arrested. None of it slowed him. 2 years earlier, this same man had crossed an international border in a rowboat at night, and the United States Army had fired a Gatling gun to cover him. A state line was not going to detain him. In August of 1877, he found his man on a train at Pensacola. The arrest lasted seconds. Armstrong killed one of Hardin's companions, put Hardin himself on the floor unconscious with a blow from his handgun, and took the rest of the party into custody. Hardin went back west in irons, and in September of 1877, a court sentenced John Wesley Hardin to 25 years for the murder of a deputy sheriff named Charles Webb. Armstrong collected the $4,000. He stayed in the service until 1881, and afterward was appointed a United States Marshal. And then, in the version of this story the family told for the next 100 years, the ranger took his reward money down into the brush country of South Texas and bought himself a ranch with it. That is the founding legend of the Armstrong Ranch. It is repeated in obituaries, in county histories, and in the family's own archive. The bounty on John Wesley Hardin became 50,000 acres of the Wild Horse Desert. It is clean, it is heroic, it fits on a plaque, and the essential part of it is true. The $4,000 was real, and it went into land. But $4,000 did not buy 14 leagues of the La Barreta Grant, because 14 leagues of the La Barreta Grant were not for sale. They were already spoken for. They had been spoken for since 1852, and since 1858 they had been sitting in the hands of two lawyers who had taken them from a dead senator's widow. The reward is the part of the story the Armstrongs told most often. The part they told less often is what happened in 1878, when the ranger who never let go of anything married a young woman named Mary Helena Durst. Chapter 6. He married the land back. Mary Helena Durst had been a small child in a ranch house in the brush when her father died, and she grew up as the heir to 14 leagues of South Texas that her family did not possess. The paper existed. The land existed. What did not exist was any practical means, for a widow with 2 children in a county that had not been created yet, of connecting the two. 20 years passed that way. In 1878, Molly Durst married John Barclay Armstrong. He was 28 and newly famous. He had $4,000 from the capture of John Wesley Hardin, a commission as a United States Marshal ahead of him, and a reputation, earned across an international border and 3 states, as a man who did not abandon a pursuit. Since arriving in Texas in 1872, he had already been buying land in his own right, tracts scattered through what are now Jim Hogg, Kleberg, and Cameron counties, running cattle on ground he had chosen himself. What he acquired by marriage was something else entirely. He acquired a grievance with a paper trail. The Texas A&M University at Kingsville archive that holds the family's records states the transfer without ornament. He married Molly Durst in 1878, gaining control of the family property. That is the whole mechanism in 5 words. The land stayed exactly where it was. The claim to it changed hands. And then, in the 1880s, the 2 families went to court. The record of what followed is brief, and it is decisive. In the 1880s, the Durst and Armstrong families set out to prove fraud on the part of the land sales, and they eventually succeeded in legally securing title to all of James Durst's holdings. That vast acreage became the Armstrong Ranch. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. A widow was stripped of 14 leagues by lawyers in the 1850s. Nothing was recovered by grief, by appeal, or by fairness. What recovered it, 30 years later, was the arrival of a man with money, celebrity, federal standing, and an appetite for a fight that would outlast the patience of everyone on the other side of it. Whatever the plaques say, the Armstrong Ranch was repossessed rather than founded. The instrument that had taken the land was the instrument that took it back, and what decided the second transfer was simply who could afford to keep going. That is the moral fork this whole film turns on, and it is worth putting to the people watching. Land recovered in a courtroom from the men who had taken it is either restitution finally arriving 30 years late, or it is simply the second time the same estate changed hands on paper without a single person on that ground getting a say. Both readings survive the evidence. Tell me in the comments which one you land on, and tell me why. It is the argument the rest of this story is built on. The land came back into the family's hands, and it began to take the shape it has today. By 1882, the ranch encompassed 50,000 acres. In 1885, John, Molly, and the woman the family called Granny Durst moved further south onto their own property, deeper into the brush, away from the river and the town, out where the coastal plain runs flat to the Gulf. It is worth saying plainly that the histories do not agree on which of these years to call the founding. The state's own handbook dates the establishment of the Armstrong Ranch to around 1893. Other accounts put it at 1882, when the ranch stood at 50,000 acres. The family's own reckoning runs all the way back to 1852, to the day James Durst bought the leagues. They are all defensible, and the disagreement is the record telling the truth about what actually happened. There was never a single founding moment. There was a purchase, a death, a theft, a marriage, a lawsuit, and a slow reoccupation of ground the family had held on paper for a generation, while other men's names sat on the deeds. By the end of the century, the Armstrongs were where they intended to be. 50,000 acres of the Wild Horse Desert, running cattle, with 825,000 acres of King Ranch on the southern fence, and no county anywhere around them. Chapter 7. The ranch was older than the law. For the next 40 years, almost nothing happened on this land that a newspaper would have printed, and that is precisely the achievement. The railroad came first. It was built as the St. Louis, Brownsville, and Mexico, and in 1904 its track reached the coastal plain and put down a stop beside the Armstrong pastures. The line later became the Missouri Pacific. What the stop meant was that cattle raised on 50,000 acres of brush no longer had to be walked north for weeks to find a buyer. They could be loaded on the ranch's own doorstep and shipped. A rail siding turned a cattle operation into an enterprise with a permanent connection to a national market, and the Armstrongs had one before most of South Texas had a paved road. A settlement gathered around the stop, the way settlements did. In 1913, a post office opened there, and it did not open under the name Armstrong. It opened under the name Catherine. It was renamed 2 years later in 1915, and the place has been called Armstrong, Texas ever since. It sits on what is now United States Highway 77, about 20 miles south of Barreta, in the west-central part of the county. Almost nobody has ever lived there. The population of Armstrong, Texas, peaked in 1929 at about 25 people. From 1931 to 1950, the settlement supported exactly one business. In 1948, it still had its railroad station. In 1956, there were several dwellings standing on the site. By the year 2000, there were about 20 residents left, scattered across the flats, and in 2011, the post office closed for good. There is a particular kind of loss in that, and it belongs to the people rather than to the family that owned the ground. A post office in a place like that stands as the proof that a community is considered to exist. Somebody sorted mail there for 98 years. Somebody kept the one store open through the Depression and the war and closed it in 1950. Children were raised within sight of the shipping pens and rode to school over a highway that ran 200 miles without turning, and learned to read the weather off a horizon with nothing on it. That world was real, it was small, it was hard, and it is gone, and the thing that outlasted it was the fence line. Because while the settlement rose to 25 people and fell to 20, the ranch never changed hands. And around all of it, the state of Texas had still not gotten organized. Kennedy County was not created as a working jurisdiction until 1921, which makes it one of the very last counties formed in Texas. Its seat, Barreta, had 185 residents as late as 1990. The county itself held about 700 people in 1940, 884 in 1960, 460 in 1990, and 404 by 2019. In 1930, there were 13 ranches in the whole county. By 1945, there were 7. 7 landholdings, 1 county. That is an estate with a government attached to it. The founder did not live to see the county named. John Barclay Armstrong died on the 1st of May, 1913, at Armstrong, Texas, 63 years old, on the ground he had married, sued for, and kept. The boy from McMinnville, Tennessee, who had crossed into Mexico in a rowboat and taken John Wesley Hardin off a train in Florida, finished in a place so quiet it would not have a post office for another 8 months. The ranch passed to his son, Charles Armstrong, and to Charles's brother Tom, and it stayed intact. That was the whole strategy, and it is the reason this family matters when so many 19th-century Texas fortunes do not. They did not diversify, they did not sell down, and they did not split the land among heirs until it stopped being an empire. They held it, generation over generation, and they waited. And in the next generation, the family did what it had been positioned to do since 1878. It married into the ranch on the other side of the southern fence. Chapter 8. The Neighbor Who Took the Throne. On the southern boundary of the Armstrong pastures runs the fence of the King Ranch, and behind that fence lie 825,000 acres. There is no polite way to state the difference in scale. The Armstrongs held 50,000 acres of the Wild Horse Desert and were, by any measure available in South Texas, a great landholding family. Their neighbor held 16 times as much. The King Ranch was not a ranch in the ordinary sense by the middle of the 20th century. It was an institution with its own breeding programs, its own executives, its own legal department, and its own mythology. And the Kleberg descendants of Captain Richard King ran it as a closed dynastic corporation. The Armstrongs did not buy their way across that fence. They married across it. John B. Armstrong was born on the 23rd of December, 1919, in San Antonio, a son of the rancher Charles M. Armstrong and Lucy Carr Armstrong. He was educated at the Texas Military Institute in San Antonio, graduating in 1937, and then at the University of Texas at Austin. In 1944, he married Henrietta Larkin, a great-granddaughter of Captain Richard King. After that marriage, the blood on both sides of that fence was the same blood. What the marriage bought in the end was access rather than acreage. John Armstrong spent the next 30 years building a reputation in the only currency the King Ranch recognized, which was cattle. From 1948, he ran independent ranching operations in Texas and Alabama. From 1957 to 1959, he served as president of Santa Gertrudis Breeders International, the body governing the Santa Gertrudis, the first American cattle breed ever granted official recognition by the United States Department of Agriculture, bred from British Shorthorn cattle crossed with Brahman bulls beginning in 1910. From 1959 to 1961, he was a regional vice president of the American National Cattlemen's Association. From 1962 to 1969, he chaired the Beef Industry Council. By the end of the 1960s, he was one of the most senior figures in the American cattle industry, and he had built that standing himself. In 1977, the King Ranch made him executive vice president of operations, and in June of 1987, John B. Armstrong became president and chief executive of King Ranch Incorporated, replacing James H. Clement at the head of 825,000 acres and everything attached to them. Consider the distance traveled. In 1858, a widow in the brush lost 14 leagues to her own lawyers. 129 years later, the great-grandson of the man who married that widow's daughter was running the largest ranch in Texas. He retired the following year, in 1988, and went back to being managing partner of his own family's ground. His wife, Henrietta, had died in 1986. He outlived her by 17 years and died in San Antonio on the 20th of February, 2003, leaving 4 children. That is the version of the Armstrong story that a Texas cattleman would tell, and it is a story about land, breeding, and patience. And it ends with a name on the door of the 825,000-acre operation next door. But it is not the branch of the family that took this ranch furthest. The person who converted 50,000 acres of South Texas brush into standing in Washington, into 3 cabinet-rank offices, into the American Embassy in London, into the boardrooms of General Motors and American Express and Halliburton, and finally into a February evening that put the ranch on every front page in the country, was not an Armstrong by blood at all. She was a young woman from New Orleans, and she married John's younger brother in 1950. Chapter 9. She was not supposed to want power. Anne Legendre was born in New Orleans on the 27th of December, 1927, into a city of iron balconies, river commerce, and old Louisiana society, and in 1950 she married a South Texas cattleman named Tobin Armstrong and moved to a ranch in the brush. It is worth being precise about what that meant, because the word ranch does a great deal of concealing work. She was not moving to the country. She was moving to 50,000 acres in a county that had been organized for less than 30 years, whose seat held under 200 people, where 7 landholdings accounted for nearly the whole of the map, and where the nearest settlement was a rail stop with 1 store and about 20 residents. The horizon had nothing on it. The road ran 200 miles without a curve. The house she came to was the social center of a district that had no other social center, and the neighbors, such as they were, owned the rest of the county. They had 5 children. By every convention of that world and that decade, the story ends there. A woman married into a Texas ranching family in 1950 was expected to run a household the size of a small hotel, receive the men who came to hunt, raise the next generation of owners, and never appear in a newspaper except beside her husband. Anne Armstrong did all of the first part, and then she went and took the Republican Party. She began where a rancher's wife would be permitted to begin, in county and state party work, and in 1966 she was made vice chairman of the Republican Party of Texas, a post she held until 1968. That is the last unremarkable line in her biography. In 1971, Anne Armstrong was elected co-chairman of the Republican National Committee. No woman had ever held that position in either national party. Not the Republicans, not the Democrats, not once. In the entire history of the American 2-party system. She was 43 years old. She lived in a county of a few hundred people, and she was now running 1/2 of the national apparatus of a party that held the presidency. The following year, the party gave her its opening night. In 1972, Anne Armstrong delivered the keynote address at the Republican National Convention and became the first woman ever to keynote a major party's national convention in the United States. The keynote is not a ceremonial slot. It is the speech that sets the terms of the campaign, delivered in prime time to the largest audience the party will assemble in 4 years, and until that night it had been given exclusively by men for as long as conventions had existed. The obvious question is how a woman with no elected office of her own, living 200 miles from a city, arrived in that position in 6 years. The answer is the ranch, and it is not a sentimental answer. In a county where 7 families held the land and a few hundred people held the votes, the owner of 50,000 acres was not a constituent. She was a constituency. She did not have to be nominated by anyone or funded by anyone. The ranch was already in itself an economic block, an employer, a landholder of consequence to the state, and a place where the powerful could be brought together privately, at length, and in comfort, far from any reporter. What the Armstrongs possessed was the thing every political operation in America wants, and almost none can buy, which is a room that no outsider can enter and no one can report on. She had been hosting that room since 1950. There is no evidence she found any of this remarkable, and that is the part worth noticing. The line the family had been running since 1878, the marriage that acquires the claim, the lawsuit that recovers the ground, the patience that holds it undivided across 3 generations, had produced a woman who understood by instinct that access is an asset and that it appreciates. 20 years after she arrived in the brush, the White House understood it too. In December of 1972, the President of the United States offered her a job that had never been given to a woman. She took her seat 1 month later, as the administration that had offered it began to come apart. Chapter 10. Defending a Sinking Presidency. The title was Counselor to the President, and it carried cabinet rank. Anne Armstrong was named to it on the 19th of December, 1972, and took up the post on the 19th of January, 1973. No woman had ever held it. She sat inside the White House with Dean Birch and Kenneth Rush as fellow counselors at the level of a cabinet secretary, with a portfolio that amounted to speaking for the administration wherever the administration needed to be spoken for. The timing is almost too neat to be real. She walked into the West Wing in January of 1973, and by the summer of that year, the presidency she had joined was being taken apart in public, hearing by hearing, on national television. What a counselor with cabinet rank does in a collapsing administration is go out and face the country. That was the assignment, and it fell to her disproportionately because of what she was. The White House had exactly 1 woman of cabinet rank, and she was articulate, composed, socially formidable, and completely unimplicated in anything that had happened in 1972. She was sent into rooms where the questions were hostile and the answers were getting harder every month. Inside the building, she created the White House Office of Women's Programs. She did not resign in the first wave or the second. She stayed. There is a cold reading of that, and there is a warm one, and the record supports both. The warm reading is loyalty, which was the currency she had been raised on and married into. A family that holds 50,000 acres undivided for 3 generations does not produce people who walk away from an obligation because it has become embarrassing. The cold reading is that this is exactly what the ranch had been built to produce. Access in American politics is not free. It is extended and it is repaid, and the repayment is very often standing in front of the cameras on the worst day and saying the thing that needs saying. Anne Armstrong had been given the highest position ever held by a woman in an American White House, and the invoice came due in a hearing room. Richard Nixon resigned in August of 1974. She did not leave with him. She stayed on as counselor to Gerald Ford and resigned the post that December, having served 2 presidents in the same office in under 2 years, the second of whom had not appointed her. By any ordinary measure, that is the end of a career. She was in her 40s. She had held a cabinet rank post through the constitutional crisis that ended a presidency, and the administration she had defended was gone. The obvious next step was the ranch, the children, and a quiet position on some board. Before I take you into the second half of her career, which is the half almost nobody knows, one thing. If this is the kind of American history you want more of, the long-form kind that starts with a land deed and ends in a boardroom, subscribe to the channel. It genuinely decides which of these get made. Because Anne Armstrong was not finished, she had barely started. In 1976, Gerald Ford appointed her United States ambassador to the Court of St. James's. She took up the post on the 17th of March, 1976, and held it until the 3rd of March, 1977. She was the first woman the United States had ever sent to Britain as its ambassador. The London embassy is not a quiet posting. The American ambassador to Britain is a public figure in the host country from the day of arrival, photographed, quoted, and measured. A cattleman's wife from Kennedy County, Texas, took the residence in London and represented the United States to the United Kingdom. And that same year, her name was in the conversation for the national ticket. Ford was preparing to run in 1976, and Anne Armstrong was widely seen as a likely contender to be his running mate. He did not choose her. But the fact of the consideration is the fact that matters because it happened in 1976, and no woman would actually be nominated for vice president by a major American party until Geraldine Ferraro in 1984, 8 years later. 8 years before the country saw a woman on a national ticket, the shortlist for one ran through a 50,000-acre ranch in the emptiest county in Texas. She came home from London in March of 1977 to the brush, the horizon, and the shipping pens at 49 years old, with the whole of the American establishment now open to her. In 1980, she chaired Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign, and then she went into the boardrooms. Chapter 11. The seat she held when they hired him. The second half of Anne Armstrong's career took place in rooms with no press gallery, and it is the half that decided how this story ends. Start with the ledger, because the ledger is the argument. She sat on the board of American Express. She sat on the board of Boise Cascade, the Timber and Paper Corporation. She sat on the Corporate Advisory Council of General Motors. And she sat on the board of the Halliburton Company, the oil field services and construction group headquartered in Texas. Banking and payments, timber and paper, automobiles, oil field services, and heavy construction. On the 20th of October, 1981, Ronald Reagan made her chair of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, the board that advises the President of the United States on the conduct of American intelligence. She held that chairmanship until the 17th of July, 1990, nearly 9 years, across 2 presidencies. In 1987, Reagan gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor the United States confers. She chaired the Board of Trustees of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. She served as a regent of the Texas A&M University system. Count what that means at any single moment in the 1980s. A woman living on a cattle ranch in a Texas county of a few hundred people sat in the boardrooms of American Express, Boise Cascade, and Halliburton, and on the Corporate Advisory Council of General Motors, chaired the Intelligence Advisory Board that reports to the President, chaired the trustees of a Washington foreign policy institution, and wore the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Almost none of it was elected. Almost none of it was public. All of it was access, extended and repaid, exactly as it had been in 1973. And then, in 1995, the Halliburton Company hired a new chairman and chief executive. Thomas Cruikshank was retiring after 12 years running the corporation. The man who succeeded him had never run a company. He had spent his entire career in the government of the United States. His name was Richard Bruce Cheney. Anne Armstrong was on the Halliburton board through the years Dick Cheney ran that company, and when he finally left it, she was the director the press went to for an assessment of him. The record establishes that and no more, and this film will not go past it. There is nothing to show that she recruited him, selected him, or led the search that found him. What the record shows is simpler and, for the purposes of this story, entirely sufficient. Dick Cheney ran Halliburton, and Anne Armstrong of the Armstrong Ranch sat on its board. Her assessment of him, given later, was warm and unqualified. "He has been a wonderful chief executive officer," she said. His international contacts have been invaluable. That is the whole of the connection, stated Flatt, and it is worth pausing on because of what it makes possible. In American public life, there is a category of relationship that has no name and no disclosure requirement. It is not employment. It is not lobbying. It is not a campaign contribution. It is the fact of having sat in the same room, at the same table, on the same fiduciary body for years, and of owning a place where that person can be invited for a weekend without a single reporter learning of it. So here is the fork, and it is a real one. One reading is that this is corruption in its most refined form. A private family converts land into board seats into proximity, proximity into influence, and influence back into protection for the land, and none of it is illegal because none of it is written down anywhere as a transaction. The other reading is that this is simply how a small American class has always arranged itself. The same few hundred people sit on the same boards, hunt on the same ground, and appoint one another, not out of conspiracy but out of familiarity. And calling it corruption misunderstands it as badly as calling it innocent. Tell me in the comments which of those two you think this is. I am not going to tell you which one I hold, because the record supports an argument either way, and the argument is the point. Cheney left Halliburton in the year 2000. Later that same year, he was elected Vice President of the United States. And for decades, the Armstrongs had been bringing the powerful down to the ranch to shoot quail. Chapter 12. A room where the powerful came to shoot. While his wife was in the West Wing, in the London Embassy, and on 5 corporate boards, Tobin Armstrong was on the ranch, and he was on it for almost 60 years. He was born in San Antonio on the 9th of July, 1923, and grew up in the brush. He was a fourth-generation Texan, a cattleman by trade and by preference, and the managing partner of 50,000 acres. He worked that ground for the better part of 6 decades, which is to say he spent his entire adult life on the same land his great-grandfather had married into, and he never ran for anything. That division of labor is the quiet engine of this whole story. One of them kept the land. The other converted what the land conferred. Because a great ranch in the second half of the 20th century was no longer primarily an agricultural enterprise, whatever the tax filings said, it was a venue. Over the second half of the 20th century, the ranch collected guests the way other estates collect paintings, and it did it 20 miles from a settlement of 20 people in a county with no incorporated city in it. The ranch became, in the plain description of the historians who have looked at it, a quiet destination for the powerful. Quiet is the operative word, and it was not an accident of geography. It was the product itself. Consider what the Armstrong Ranch offered a public figure in Washington that no hotel, no club, no resort, and no private home in a city could offer. There is one road. There is a gate. Beyond the gate, there is nothing for miles in any direction, no line of sight from a public right-of-way, no adjacent property with a view in, no service staff who are not employed by the family, and no possibility whatever of a photographer. 50,000 acres of thorn brush is not scenery. It is a perimeter. Inside that perimeter, a cabinet secretary, a chief executive, a foreign royal, or a vice president could spend 3 days walking behind dogs, eating lunch under an oak, and talking to whoever the family had also invited, and no record of any of it would exist unless someone in the party chose to make one. That is what the descendants of a ranger and a defrauded widow were ultimately selling, and it is worth being clear that they were not selling it for money. Nobody paid an invoice. What the ranch produced was obligation, and obligation compounds quietly across decades in a way that money never does. The ritual at the center of it was quail. The brush country of South Texas is quail country, and the winter hunt was the reason people came. Dogs, guides, a line of walkers, a covey flushing out of the grass in front of them, and shotguns coming up fast against a low sun. It is a genuinely beautiful thing to watch, and a genuinely dangerous one, because a flushing covey scatters and the birds go low, and a man swinging on a bird at the edge of his vision is aiming at whatever happens to be in that direction. For 50 years, nothing happened. Tobin Armstrong died on the 7th of October, 2005, in Houston, of complications of cancer. He was 82 years old. He had ranched that country for nearly 60 years, buried his generation, raised the next, and handed on an estate that had not been divided since the 1880s. His widow, Anne, was 77 and had spent 30 years inside the American establishment. Their daughter, Catherine Armstrong, a fifth-generation Texan, was one of the owners of the ranch. 4 months later, in the second week of February, the Vice President of the United States came down for the birds. Chapter 13. He never saw the other hunter. The 11th of February, 2006, was a Saturday, and the party that went out into the brush that morning was not an ordinary hunting party by any measure. There was the Vice President of the United States. There was Catherine Armstrong of the family. There was her mother, Anne Legendre Armstrong, 78 years old, former counselor to the President, former ambassador, former chair of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. There was Pamela Pitzer Williford, the sitting United States ambassador to Switzerland. There was a guide named Oscar Medellin and other guides, and the dogs. And there was a 78-year-old lawyer from Austin named Harry Whittington. Whittington was not, whatever the press would report over the following week, an old friend of the Vice President. He said afterward that the two of them were barely acquainted. He was a Texas Republican of long standing who had managed a winning United States Senate campaign for John Tower in 1961 and worked on a losing one for George Bush in 1964, and who had sat on the Texas Prison Board from 1979 to 1985. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man the Armstrong Ranch had been assembling in its guest book for half a century. They hunted through the morning. At midday, the party stopped for lunch under an old oak tree, and it was there, the Vice President said later, that he drank a beer. The family's first public account of the day stated flatly that there had been no drinking at all. Catherine Armstrong's words were zero, zippo. Those two accounts were given days apart, and they do not reconcile, and nothing in the record ever reconciled them. The hunt resumed in the middle of the afternoon. By 5:30, the light was going. On the coastal plain in February, the sun drops fast and flat and comes straight into the eyes of anyone facing west. The dogs put up a covey, and Harry Whittington shot at it, and one of the birds went down. He walked out to find it, which is what a hunter does, and then he came back toward the vehicle where Catherine Armstrong was waiting. She told him a second covey had gone up, off to the other side, where Oscar Medellin had found it. Whittington turned and walked toward the second covey. He did not announce himself to the men already working that ground, and there is no evidence he thought he needed to, because he was walking toward birds he had been told about by one of the owners of the ranch. The Vice President was standing where those birds were. A quail came up. Cheney swung on it, following the bird across the low light with a 28-gauge Perazzi shotgun, and fired. Harry Whittington was about 30 yards away, by the official account. The load broke apart in the air the way birdshot does, and more than 200 pellets, each of them smaller than 2.5 millimeters across, went into his face, his neck, and his torso. He remembered almost none of it afterward. What he remembered and what he said years later was this: All I remember is the smell of burning powder. And then I passed out. The vice president's own ambulance was in the party, because a vice president travels with one. Whittington was loaded into it and driven 42 miles to a small hospital, and from there taken on to Corpus Christi. He woke in a hospital bed with his face and neck and chest swollen and peppered. 30 pellets or so had lodged too deep or too dangerously to take out. One was in his eye socket, one was in his larynx, and it changed his voice for the rest of his life. One had gone into his chest and come to rest against his heart. 3 days later, on the morning of the 14th of February at 6:30, that pellet did what the doctors had feared. Harry Whittington went into atrial fibrillation and suffered a heart attack. His lung had collapsed. He was 78 years old, and he had been shot in the face by the Vice President of the United States, and for a period on that Tuesday morning, it was genuinely unclear whether he was going to live. What was said publicly, while he was in that bed, is part of the record, too. The White House put it about that Whittington had caused it, that he had walked into the line of fire without announcing himself, that the fault lay with the man in the hospital. The man in the hospital did not dispute it. All of that was still to come. On the evening of the 11th of February, as the light went out of the coastal plain and an ambulance ran north over ranch roads toward a town, there was one more thing that had not happened yet, and it is the thing this entire story has been building toward since 1852. Nobody outside that gate knew. The Vice President of the United States had shot a man, and the decision about when the country would be told did not belong to the White House, or to the Secret Service, or to the sheriff of the county. It belonged to the family that owned the land. Chapter 14. The country was not told. What happened in the next 20 hours is the reason this is a story about land and not a story about a hunting accident. Roughly an hour after the shot, the Secret Service telephoned the sheriff of the county. Ramon Salinas III had been sheriff of a jurisdiction with a few hundred residents and a handful of deputies, and he now had a report that the Vice President of the United States had shot a man on the Armstrong Ranch. He sent his chief deputy out to the property that night. The deputy did not get in. At least one Kennedy County deputy was turned away at the ranch gate shortly after the shooting. The Secret Service later explained it as a misunderstanding, a spokesman saying that the security personnel at the ranch had not been aware of the arrangement between the sheriff and the service. Whatever the explanation, the fact stands on its own. A sworn county law officer, responding to a shooting in his own jurisdiction, was stopped at a private fence line and did not proceed. Somewhere between 8 and 9 o'clock that Saturday evening, a telephone call came in to the ranch from Karl Rove. Karl Rove was the deputy chief of staff of the White House. He was not calling the Secret Service, and he was not calling the sheriff. He was calling the family that owned the property, and he was doing it within hours of the shot, while Harry Whittington was in a hospital bed in Corpus Christi, and while the wire services in Washington had no idea that anything had occurred anywhere in Texas. Then the night passed. On Sunday morning, some 14 hours after the shooting, the sheriff's chief deputy finally sat down with the Vice President of the United States and took his account of what had happened. He reported that the shooting was an accident. No charges were ever filed. At around the same hour, a vice presidential aide reached the political strategist Mary Matalin with a draft statement in hand. And also, on that Sunday morning, Catherine Armstrong decided that it was time. She told the vice president she was going to inform the local newspaper. Then she picked up a telephone and called the mobile number of a reporter named Jamie Powell at the Corpus Christi Caller-Times, a regional daily on the South Texas coast. She did not reach Powell immediately. She got through late in the morning and gave her the account. The story went up on the newspaper's website at 1 on Sunday afternoon. 20 hours had passed since the Vice President of the United States fired the shot. Those were not 20 hours of confusion or medical uncertainty. They were 20 hours in which the Secret Service knew, the sheriff knew, the White House political operation knew, the hospital knew, and the machinery of the federal government knew, and in which the American public was told nothing because the disclosure was not theirs to make. It was made by a private citizen on her own timetable to a regional paper of her own choosing, from a ranch house on land her family had held since the 1880s. And the private citizen was not a bystander. Catherine Armstrong had been appointed to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission by Governor George W. Bush in 1999, and in 2001, Governor Rick Perry made her its chairman, the first woman to lead that agency in its history. The commission she chaired is the body that regulates hunting in the state of Texas. She was also, in the description Time magazine used of her at the time, a well-connected Republican lobbyist. So the sequence, laid end to end, reads as follows. A vice president shoots a man on private ground. A county deputy is turned away at the gate. The White House Deputy Chief of Staff telephones the ranch the same evening. The deputy is admitted 14 hours later, and the announcement to the American people is made, at a moment of her choosing, by a Republican lobbyist who had chaired the state agency that regulates the activity in question. Every individual link in that chain has an innocent explanation, and every one of those explanations was offered at the time. What none of them explains is the shape of the whole thing. It is the shape of a household managing an incident on its own property, in the way this family had been managing its own affairs since there was no county here to manage them for it. The Wild Horse Desert had produced exactly what it was always going to produce. And in the end, the total penalty assessed against the Vice President of the United States for shooting Harry Whittington came to $7. Chapter 15. It cost him $7. The accounting, when it was finally done, took one line. Richard Bruce Cheney held a valid Texas non-resident season hunting license for which he had paid $125. What he did not hold was the $7 stamp that Texas requires of anyone shooting upland game birds. Neither did Harry Whittington. Both men were admonished for it. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department issued the Vice President a warning citation, noting that the stamp requirement had come into force only about 5 months earlier and that warnings were being issued in most such cases, and the department classified the shooting itself as an error in judgment. Cheney then sent Texas Parks and Wildlife a check for $7. The sheriff of the county filed no charges. There was no prosecution, no inquest, no hearing, and no finding of fault by anybody with the power to make one. For putting more than 200 pellets into a 78-year-old man's face, neck, and chest, the recorded penalty against the second highest office holder in the United States was a warning slip and $7. He spoke publicly for the first time on the 15th of February, 4 days after the shot, in a television interview, and he accepted, in his words, full responsibility for the accident. Harry Whittington left the hospital on the 17th of February with about 30 pellets still inside him and a voice that no longer sounded like his own. He stood in front of the cameras, swollen and bruised down one side of his face, and he apologized. "My family and I are deeply sorry for all that Vice President Cheney and his family have had to go through this past week," he said, and then, "Accidents do and will happen." The man who had been shot in the face said sorry to the man who shot him. Dick Cheney never apologized to Harry Whittington. He never contacted him personally at all. Whittington waited, and he was still waiting 5 years later, and when a reporter finally asked him directly whether an apology had ever come, he would not answer the question. He lived another 17 years with the shot still in him. He kept the pellet near his heart, the pellet in his eye socket, the pellet in his larynx, because the doctors judged the removal more dangerous than the metal. "Sometimes I wonder why I got all these extra years," he said. Harry Whittington died at his home in Austin in early February of 2023, at 95 years old. Anne Legendre Armstrong died in Houston on the 30th of July, 2008, at 80. She had advised 4 presidents, and she had done it from a cattle ranch. And the machine she built is still running. The Texas Public Policy Foundation, the Austin Institute that argues energy and environmental policy in this state, runs a research arm called the Armstrong Center for Energy and the Environment. The family name sits on the door of a room where Texas energy policy gets written. Nothing about that is improper. Everything about it is the point. And the land is still there, still held, still fenced along the lines drawn in the 1880s. 50,000 acres of the Wild Horse Desert, with the Noria's division of the 825,000-acre King Ranch running along the southern line, in a county that the King Ranch itself covers much of. Around all of it, the county is nearly empty. The 2020 census counted 350 people in Kennedy County, across 1,458 square miles. It is the 3rd least populous county in the state of Texas and the 4th least populous in the United States. In 2002, there were 28 ranches in it, covering 474,073 acres. And the state's own handbook records in the present tense that most of the land still remains in the hands of the Armstrong, King, Kennedy, and Uturia interests. 4 names, 1 county, 170 years. I want to hear from the people this land actually belonged to before any of it was written down in English. If your family name is on one of the old Spanish grants of the Nueces Strip, or if your grandparents worked cattle in that brush for wages and were never named in anybody's history, say so in the comments and tell us what they were called. The deeds recorded the owners. They did not record anyone else, and this channel would rather have the names than the acreage. If you want more of these, subscribe, and the next one gets made, because the shape of this story never changed. In 1852, a man bought 14 leagues of a Spanish grant on paper. In 1858, he died, and his widow lost every acre of it on paper, to 2 lawyers who never had to raise a hand. In the 1880s, a Texas ranger who had married the widow's daughter took it back on paper, in a courtroom, from men who had assumed no one out there could afford to fight them. And for the next century and a half, everything that family gained and everything it survived was arranged the same quiet way, in documents, behind a gate, on a plain, with nobody on it to see. The paper is still there. It is a deed now, and a fence line, and a family name on a policy center in Austin, in a county with 350 people left in it to object.